particular focus on cultural history with an emphasis on music, as many of you know from having read his work. He is currently completing a 3-book-length manuscript, a biography of pianist and composer Thelonious Monk, a generative narrative of African-American history in a global context, co-authored with Professors Tara Hunter and Earl Lewis, which will be published by Norton, and a series of essays on history and black music to be published by Harvard University Press as part of Nathan Huggins' lectures sponsored by Harvard's Afro-American Studies program. I know of Professor Kelly both from good sources, his mother and his sister, who are good friends of mine, but also from his work, in particular Race Rebels, which I'm particularly fond of. I regard him as one of the more important historians in the country, writing about popular culture, resistance in particular amongst African Americans, a kind of history that's not been well told. Professor Kelly has won a number of awards for his work. He won the Outstanding Book Award for Race Rebels, the Elliott Rudwick Prize from the Organization for American Historians for Hammer and Hoe in 1991. That was not a rap book. That was that was another kind of book. The Francis Butler Simpkins Prize from the Southern Historical Association, also for Hammer and Hoe. The Outstanding Book Award, a book for the teenage by the New York Public Library for his book Into the Fire. And Village Voice Best Books of 1997 for Your Mama's Dysfunctional. It's my pleasure to introduce Robin Kelly.
Wow, thanks for coming. Those of you in the back, move up. No, I'm just kidding. Don't you hate when people do that? You know, come, be more intimate. You don't want to be intimate. Anyway, it's great to be here. And first of all, I want to thank Pedro for that wonderful introduction. He does know my mother and he knows my sister. And the thing I'm afraid of is that my mother and sister are two of the most amazing people I know. So unfortunately, I may not live up to his expectations. I'm going to try, though. My mom right now is in graduate school at UC Berkeley working on a PhD in ethics studies, which is wonderful because when I was in college at Long Beach State working on in black studies and ethnic studies, my mom was like, what are you going to do with that? So, of course, I tell her, what are you going to do with that? You know? Also, I have to thank Dottie Engler for inviting me. This is the second time I've done this, and of course, she's always wonderful. The crowds are always great, and people ask great questions. So what I want to do is not take up too much time and be as brief as possible. I also have a little present. For those of you who can't afford to buy the book, I have these little pamphlets here. Now, what are these pamphlets? These are limited edition. There's only a few of them, so it's like first come, first serve. These limited edition, this is from an article that was an excerpt from the book that came out in Chronicle of Our Education. This is an abridged version. But what's special about this little pamphlet is that it's a collaboration between myself, my 12-year-old daughter, and my wife Deirdre. And Deirdre Harris Kelly is the artist who did the artwork on this book, which is beautiful. By the way, if you buy the book, I would cut out the piece, frame it. You know, forget about the jacket, but the piece is so beautiful. We could talk about that. Anyway, this is a collaboration, and what I did was I had Eliza go through and redesign the text. So she redesigned the text of that piece in the way that felt that made sense to her. So there are certain words that kind of explode, and certain words that are italicized, certain words in different fonts. And then she drew these little pictures on the margins. Now, if you know my daughter Eliza, she is bound to fame. Big time. She'll make all of us embarrassed. So if you get one of these, save it. You know, this would be Eliza Kelly's thing. So anyway, so I'm going to hand those out for free when I go sign those books. Okay. What I want to do is basically talk a little bit about this book, where it came from, and then read a few passages and really have a conversation with you, if you don't mind. Freedom Dreams is a kind of collective history of the black radical imagination. It's an attempt at writing the history of black radical social movements, focusing on what people in particular movements dreamed of, you know, what they thought about, what they were fighting for, what they articulated as a new world or the new land. And I'm also interested in what moved them to struggle in the first place. In some ways, this book came out of nowhere because a lot of editors are very mad at me right now because, as Pedro had mentioned, I have all these other projects that are in the works that should have been done, like this book on Monk. So when my editor found out I had another book come out before the Thelonious Monk book, you know, he hit the roof. He's like, "What's wrong with you?" Because I didn't know I wrote this book until it was written. I mean, I swear, I'm not making this up. It's one of these situations where I didn't know I was working on it, and it just sort of happened because each of the chapters were things I was thinking about. But when I really kind of stepped back, I realized that this is a project that was 20 years in the works. It goes back to probably before 20 years, but at least to my college days, to days when a lot of us in my generation were very active in social movements. And in some ways, it's a product of a constant questioning of even my own work and my own assumptions. All my work in the past have been attempts at writing histories of black radical social movements and trying to figure out why they fail, why they succeed, who joins them and why, what are they struggling for, and how the struggle itself transforms those participants. And I've spent most of my life around people trying to do that. You know, my sister is one who's always been an activist from the time she was 5 years old. And I'm surrounded by these people who are always trying to make movement. And from the time I was a small child, you know, in Harlem, you know, witnessing, observing the Black Panther Party as a little kid, the Black Liberation Army, up to college, being in the Black Student Union, being involved in anti-apartheid movements, invasion of Grenada. Now you know why I have all this gray hair, because I'm old. Some of you weren't even born in those days, you know, which is scary to think. But I mean, this is like my own political coming of age. You know, reading Fanon, reading Cabral, reading C.L.R. James, Marx, Lenin, Mao, all this stuff. And all that, you know, all that activism, all that participation kind of forced me to think about what was it we were doing in the first place? What was the long-term goal? A lot of the reading that we did was about a long-term goal, whether that long-term goal was socialism or something else. And for a while, a lot of my work kind of, I don't want to say ignored the long-term goal, but I didn't realize how important it was. And sometimes when you're a historian and you're in the moment, you end up writing histories that focus on the institutional projects, the institutional constraints that movements are up against. Now, I'm not here to tell you that I've kind of outgrown the days when, you know, when activism kind of drove my scholarship, you know, and that somehow now I'm a detached historian, detached objective historian. I'm not. I never will be. And I hope that on my gravesite, well, actually I'm going to be cremated, but if there's something like left behind, it would say Robin Kelley was never detached and never objective. You know, he actually had a goal in mind. And the reason why I always studied history was to try to figure out which way to go forward. But, you know, despite all that, I'm convinced now, as I was, say, 2 decades ago, that scholarship inspired by political questions and concerns about the future actually makes for good history. It doesn't make for bad history, as we're told. On the contrary, it's often sharper and more urgent. This is a long tradition of African-American letters. You know, so much of that scholarship is urgent. It's raising questions about which way to go forward, rather than just being curious about the past. I'm not really curious about the past. I'm really curious about how we make a new future, and it's always driven my work. Now, Freedom Dreams, having said that, is not a handbook or a guide. It's not meant to provide a model for radical social movements. On the contrary, it is a work of historical recovery and interpretation, and the essays in this book attempt to explore the radical utopian dreams held by certain 20th century black political activists, artists, and black movements in general. I begin this book with the premise that the catalyst for all political engagement has never been misery or poverty or oppression, but hope, you know. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but all the evidence suggests to me that hope is much more important than misery, poverty, or oppression, what drives people to these movements. The promise of constructing a new world radically different from the one they've inherited. In some ways, the book is a meditation on the black radical imagination, a kind of third-eye view of history that attempts to recover the dreams of a new world that has yet to be realized. And what I end up doing in the book is focusing on Back to Africa movements, socialism, third world liberation, surrealism, radical black feminism, and reparations. And I argue that these renegade black intellectuals, activists, artists, not only created a vision often more inclusive than some of the Euro-American counterparts, but in doing so, produced insights that might have pushed what we consider Western radicalism in new directions. I don't know if I want to call it Western radicalism. Maybe it's modern radicalism. I haven't figured that out yet. But more often than not, the critical visions of black radicals were held at bay, if not completely marginalized. Now, politically, a book about how freedom is imagined and how particular movements tried to realize freedom seemed important because we spend so much time putting out fires, taking a defensive position, given all the crisis we're dealing with. And scholars are often focused on explaining why movements fail, and we don't always pay enough attention to what they hope to achieve. So what I want to do with the remaining time is just take a few minutes and read some excerpts that may give you a sharper, clearer sense of what the book's about. And hopefully these excerpts will be somewhat controversial and will generate some discussion and debate. Well, I guarantee that even if you don't say a word, that some people have some issues, And I don't mind, because that's what I'm here for, And I'll try to describe this. I don't want to take up too much time because I really like to have a discussion. What I'm not going to read from is the introduction and the preface because, again, that piece has got a lot of circulation in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And so I would suggest you read it because it's my favorite part of the book because I could talk about my mother. I love my mother. You got to understand. My mother is the greatest person in the world. She's the smartest person in the world, And I just a little aside, I had to write a letter of recommendation for her for graduate school. Man, that was like the greatest thing and the most difficult thing I ever had to do. See, because I think I wrote about 4 pages, single space. And because it's the only letter I ever wrote where I said, I have known this person all my life. But you'll see, when her book comes out, it'll be the bomb, I tell you. One other funny thing is that, her first year at Berkeley, in the kind of core course in ethnic studies, they assigned 2 of my books. And that was weird. So she's in the class reading my books. And unfortunately, one she hadn't read before, which she, embarrassingly enough, admitted to me. And of course, she's in a classroom where everyone knows she's my mom. And so they expect all this stuff from her. But she was sharp and critical and, tore it apart. So that's good. Okay, let me just read a couple things. This is from the chapter called Dreams of the New Land, which is about the meaning of Back to Africa movements. I won't say much more than that. Now, Schoolhouse Rock didn't teach me a damn thing about freedom. The kids like me growing up in Harlem during the 1960s and early 70s heard that word in the streets. It rang in our ears with the regularity of a hit song. Everybody and their mama spoke of freedom, and what they meant usually defied the popular meanings of the day. Whereas most Americans associated freedom with Western democracies, at war against communism, free market capitalism, or U.S. intervention in countries such as Vietnam or the Dominican Republic. In our neighborhood, freedom had no particular tie to U.S. nationality. Freedom was the goal our people were trying to achieve. Free was a verb, an act, a wish, a militant demand. Free the land, free your mind, free South Africa, free Angola, free Angela, free Huey were the slogans I remember best. Of course, freedom was always employed as a marketing tool to sell us things like Afro wigs, hair care products, and various foodstuffs. But even these commodities were linked in our minds to the black struggle for independence, not just in the urban ghettos, but around the world. Freedom even became a kind of metonym for Africa, the home we never knew, the place where we once enjoyed freedom before we were forcibly taken in chains across the sea. We drank Afro Cola, which came in a blue can emblazoned with a map of the African continent, partly because slick marketing executives told us it contained the taste of freedom, partly because we pretended it was nectar from the motherland. Of course, not everyone identified with Africa or associated the continent with dreams of freedom, but we were living in Harlem, of all places, during the era of the Black Freedom Movement. Formal colonialism had ended throughout most of Africa, the exceptions being Southern Africa and the Portuguese colonies. So those who paid attention to such things were excited by the prospects of a free and independent Africa. By the time I enrolled at California State University at Long Beach, the Black Studies program there reignited my nascent underdeveloped Pan-African vision of the world. Our professors turned die-hard party people and wannabe Greeks into angry young Africans. And we had good reason to be angry. We learned of the origins of Western racism, the history of slavery, the rise and fall of African kingdoms before the European invasion, the Egyptian roots of Western civilization. We were particularly obsessed with the large-scale civilizations along the Nile, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, as were generations of Afrocentric scholars before us, as Wilson Moses recently pointed out in his valuable book, Afrotopia. Indeed, the title alone explains why we junior Afrocentrists were attracted more to the powerful states of the ancient world than to the civil rights movement. We looked back in search of a better future. We wanted to find refuge where, quote, Black people exercised power, possessed essential knowledge, educated the West, built monuments, slept under the stars on the banks of the Nile, and never had to worry about the police or poverty or arrogant white people questioning our intelligence. Of course, this meant conveniently ignoring slave labor, class hierarchies, and women's oppression, and it meant projecting backwards in time a 20th century conception of race. But to simply criticize us for myth-making or essentialism misses the point of our reading. We dreamed the ancient world as a place of freedom, a picture to imagine what we desired and what was possible. Sometimes we couldn't read fast enough. Other times, we were so overtaken with emotion, we put our books down and wept or fantasized about revenge. More importantly, we began to see ourselves, as earlier generations of Black intellectuals had, as part of an African diaspora, an oppressed nation without a homeland. Many of us gravitated to campus Black nationalist groups, imagining Africa as our true home, either as a place of eventual return or a place from which we were permanently exiled. At least in our minds, we joined a long line of Black thinkers who believed that to achieve freedom, we first had to get out of Dodge. And the rest of the chapter is about Black people trying to get out of Dodge, basically, from the 19th century on up. And not just traveling to Africa. Towards the end of that chapter, I talk about interstellar space, space travel. And because, there's all kinds of motherlands. But, you could read it if you get the book. There's another chapter I deal with, which is kind of controversial, but also, I think, very relevant to today, and that's to do with reparations. And in this chapter on reparations, I focus not on the calculation of loss, not on juridical issues, which I think there's some great scholars doing that kind of work, fantastic work, trying to calculate. My chapter is not about calculations. It's about thinking of reparations as a social movement whose roots go back to at least the eve of the Civil War. And so I kind of look at the whole 40 Acres and the Mule movement, the movements for slave pensions, turn of the century, up to Black nationalist movements in the 20th century, with the focus on not the costs, but on transforming societies. And so this section I'm going to read is towards the end of that chapter where I end up talking about, the Black Manifesto in Cobra, as well as movements from the 40s and 50s. So this section is called A Case for Reparations and Transformation. Now, if we think of reparations as part of a broad strategy to radically transform society, redistributing wealth, creating a democratic and caring public culture, exposing the ways capitalism and slavery produce massive inequality, then the ongoing struggle for reparations holds enormous promise for revitalizing movements for social justice. Consider the context. For at least the last quarter century, we have witnessed a general backlash against the Black community. Republican and Democratic administrations dismantled most state protections for poor people of color, expanded the urban police state, virtually eliminated affirmative action and welfare as we knew it, and significantly weakened institutions and laws created to protect civil rights. All these cutbacks were justified by a discourse that blamed black behavior for contemporary urban poverty and turned what were once called rights, i.e. welfare, into privileges. The argument for reparations not only recasts these measures as rights, but as payback. It shows how more than 2 centuries of U.S. policy facilitated accumulation among white property owners while further impoverishing African Americans. Thus, federal assistance to black people in any form is not a gift, but a down payment for centuries of unpaid labor, violence, and exploitation. And we need not go all the way back to slavery to make the case. We can point to more than a century of discrimination to explain the myriad ways U.S. policies have enriched upper and middle-class whites at the expense of black people and other people of color. Let us take one example, education, which I thought was relevant for this forum. During Reconstruction, African Americans led the fight for free universal public education in the United States, not just for themselves, but for everyone. After being barred from reading and writing while in bondage, newly freed people regarded education as one of the most basic rights and privileges of citizenship. Education was so important, in fact, that they were willing to pay for public schools or start their own. In South Carolina, for example, freed people contributed nearly $13,000 to keep 23 schools running, schools that had been established by the Freedmen's Bureau. Indeed, between 1866 and 1870, newly freed people contributed more than $750,000 in cash to sustain their own schools. These are people who have been out of slavery basically in that same generation. $750,000 in cash. Once African Americans won the franchise, they made it possible for universal compulsory education to be written into state constitutions throughout the South. They also elected black legislators who succeeded in establishing boards of education and requiring compulsory education with, quote, no distinction to be made in favor of any class of persons, end quote. In South Carolina, in 1868, black and progressive white legislators made sure textbooks were provided free of charge, and within 2 years, close to 16,000 black children and 11,000 white children attended public schools. As soon as the federal government withdrew its support for Reconstruction in the Southern planter class, and New South industrialists imposed formal segregation, black students were relegated to inferior schools and denied full attendance. Rural schools for blacks, for example, often operated only a few weeks out of the year. And yet black wage earners continued to pay taxes to support public education. In the Jim Crow South, it was not unusual for African Americans to contribute 40% of the school budget, but attend schools that received 10% of the expenditures. Okay. One study conducted by researchers at Atlanta University in 1901 concluded that black taxpayers were actually subsidizing white schools. More recently, 2 years after the Supreme Court ordered desegregation of schools in 1954, the state of Virginia introduced publicly funded school vouchers to help white families send their children to private schools rather than endure integration. So you might know where vouchers came from. Go back to that. Milton Friedman's idea, by the way. The vouchers were eventually deemed unconstitutional, but during that short period of time, African American taxes were being used to help pay for white children's private school tuition. In light of how our separate and unequal education has benefited whites and cost African Americans, claims that affirmative action is, quote, reverse discrimination or a special privilege ring hollow at best. The reparations movement exposes the history of white privilege and helps us all understand how wealth and poverty are made under capitalism, particularly a capitalism shaped immeasurably by slavery and racism. It stresses the fact that labor, not CEOs, not scientists and technicians, not the magic of the so-called free market, creates wealth. The reparations movement provides an analysis of our situation that challenges victim-blaming explanations, explaining that exploitation and regressive policies create poverty, not bad behavior. It ought to compel us to pay attention to the centrality of racism in the U.S. political economy, because one of the consequences of racial differentials in income and economic opportunity is downward pressure on all wages for all working people, irrespective of color. It should also make us look at gender, because men and women did not experience exploitation in the same manner. We need to consider things like women's unpaid labor, reproduction, sexual abuse, and ways to make restitution for these distinctive forms of exploitation. At the very least, the reparations movement ought to clarify issues like what constitutes a family, if payments are to be made to such units, how we might imagine remaking relationships between men and women, boys and girls, adults and children. If radical transformation of society is one of the goals of the reparations movement, then these questions cannot be ignored. Unfortunately, most arguments in support of reparations scarcely mention gender. In the end, a successful reparations campaign has the potential to benefit the entire nation, not just the black community. Since most plans emphasize investments in institutions rather than individual payments, the result would bring massive infusion of capital for infrastructure, housing, schools, and related institutions in communities with large black populations. Monies would also be made available to support civic organizations and help establish a strong civil society among people of African descent, which in turn would strengthen civil society as a whole. Presumably, social ills such as crime, drug use, violence would be reduced considerably and thus alter the world's image of black people. Furthermore, the historically black ghetto communities to which substantial investments will be made also house other poor people of color, notably Latinos, Afro-Caribbeans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Filipinos, Samoans, South Asians, Koreans. They too would benefit from improved schools, homes, public life, and a politically strengthened black community. Given the relationship of slavery and racism to the global economy, this outcome makes perfect sense. Many of these poor immigrant groups are themselves products of centuries of imperialism, slavery's handmaiden, if you will, or descendants of slaves, as in the case of many Caribbean and Latin American immigrants. The reparations campaign, despite its potential contribution to eliminating racism and remaking the world, can never be an end to itself. Movement leaders have known this all along. The hard work of changing our values and reorganizing social life requires political engagement, community involvement, education, debate and discussion, and dreaming. Money and resources are always important, but a new vision and new values cannot be bought. And without at least a rudimentary critique of the capitalist culture that consumes us, even reparations can have disastrous consequences. Imagine if reparations were treated as startup capital for black entrepreneurs who really want to mirror the dominant society. What would really change? Anyway, just a thought. The last section I wanted to read has to do with my chapter on surrealism. And it's an area that surprised a lot of people when they read the book, people I've talked to, because they know me as, oh, that's the communist. That's Robin Kelley, the communist. Yeah, that's his thing, And surrealism was something I knew very little about and got interested in its history through Thelonious Monk, because it turns out that a lot of the surrealists in Europe, United States, Brazil, everywhere, they love Monk. So they would write a lot of things about Monk. So in following Monk's story, I found surrealism. I found it in M.A. Césaire and Suzanne Césaire. I found it with Wilfredo Lam. I found it in all these different intellectuals and artists and people you've never heard of. And so in following Monk's story, I followed the story of black surrealists and tried to write a kind of a brief history, a beginning of a brief history of this movement. And I don't want to say much more than that. A number of the people I end up talking about in this chapter, aside from Césaire, the Césaires, or Richard Wright, Jane Cortez, Ted Jones, certainly Wilfredo Lam, a bunch of people that you might not have heard of, a group of Martinican surrealists who put out a journal called Légitime Défense, and others who are sort of on the edges of this movement. So what I'm going to do is just read the introduction and then the kind of conclusion part of it. Trust me, there's a lot of history in there. So, I'm skipping all the history because I don't want to bore you. But it's actually not boring. I just don't have much time. This chapter is called Keeping Its Surreal Dreams of the Marvelous. And I begin with a little epigraph by Thelonious Monk, where he says, it's always night or we wouldn't need light. Just think about that. It's always night or we wouldn't need light. Okay. Now, Monk's statement should be taken as more than a clever observation about physics. As one of the greatest jazz pianists and composers of the 20th century, Monk often began work after the sun disappeared over the horizon. Thus he understood the power and ubiquity of night. The nighttime is the right time, a time to reveal and fulfill desire, a time to dream, the world of the unknown, the hallucinatory. It was 19th century poet Lautréamont who wrote, quote, "It is only by admitting the night physically that one is able to admit it morally." Now for black folk, however, the night represents pleasure and danger, beauty and ugliness. Besides its blackness, with all of its mystery and elegance, richness and brilliance, the night is associated with hooded clansmen and burning crosses, the long night of slavery, the oppression of dark skin. Yes, it's always night, which is why we absolutely need light, the light of social movements. I've got the light of freedom, the light of hope, facing a rising sun of a new day begun, the light of spirit. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Monk meets Lautréamont on the night train to freedom. It is one of the many chance encounters that reveal a deep affinity between black life and culture and surrealism. Neither man would have identified himself as a surrealist, although Lautréamont, along with another 19th century French poet named Arthur Rimbaud, are considered the spiritual fathers of surrealism before the movement was declared after World War I. And yet they embody the basic principles of surrealism, a living, mutable, creative vision of a world where love, play, human dignity, and an end to poverty and want and imagination are the pillars of freedom. What is surrealism? Its definition is as rich and evasive as the night itself. Here's one answer from the Chicago Surrealist Group from 1976. Quote, "Surrealism is the exaltation of freedom, revolt, imagination, and love. It is above all a revolutionary movement. Its basic aim is to lessen and eventually to completely resolve the contradictions between everyday life and our wildest dreams. By definition, subversive, surrealist thought and action are intended not only to discredit and destroy the forces of repression, but also to emancipate desire and supply it with new poetic weapons. Beginning with the abolition of imaginative slavery, it advances to the creation of a free society in which everyone will be a poet, a society in which everyone will be able to develop his or her own potentialities fully and freely." End quote. And by plunging into the depth of the unconscious and lessening the contradiction between everyday life and our wildest dreams, we can enter or realize the domain of the marvelous. Surrealism is no mere artistic movement like Cubism or Impressionism, and it's not primarily concerned with art. Surrealism is about making a new life. Now, some of these principles, one might argue, were present in Afro-diasporic culture before Surrealism was ever named. In this chapter, I explore how Black revolt shaped the development of Surrealism as a self-conscious political movement, as well as the impact Surrealism has had on modern political and cultural movements throughout the African diaspora. Surrealism, I contend, offers a vision of freedom far deeper and more expansive than any of the movements discussed thus far. It is a movement that invites dreaming, urges us to improvise and invent and recognize the imagination as our most powerful weapon. And I go on to sort of explain that. And I just decided, because I'm in improvised mode today, that I probably won't read that last section. Yeah, I don't think so. I like it, though. It's like one of my favorite things to read. But, it may take a little longer. So let me just end, because I really don't want to take up too much time. Let me end with one little thing, which is from the chapter called This Battlefield Called Life, Black Feminist Dreams. And, this is really not, I don't pretend that any of these chapters are actual full histories of any of these movements. I mean, that's what my graduate students do. They write full histories of these movements. I'm just trying to sort of make some remarks about them by kind of recovering in a very essayistic form aspects of this history. And so the chapter on Black radical feminism is idiosyncratic. It's based on following particular movements like the Combahee River Collective, National Black Feminist Organizations, the World Women's Alliance, but also in conversation with what gets identified as radical and revolutionary feminist organizations that are quote-unquote white. I say quote-unquote white because really there's not that many fully, completely white organizations among feminism. A lot of feminists were multiracial organizations who actually were very interested in issues of race. Not everyone agreed, not everyone had the right take, whatever that means. But I talk a little bit about, you know, groups like Witch and Red Stockings and others, New York Radical Women. And so I try to talk about this dialogue, but really focus on what was it that brought black, particularly socialist-oriented women to these movements and what they envision. And, you know, it's an attempt at a history. I also try to go outside the United States and draw on the brilliant work of Julia Sudbury, who wrote this amazing book called Other Kinds of Dreams, Black Women's Organizations and the Politics of Transformation, which deals with England, where the definition of black feminism includes, you know, South Asian, Arab women, Afro-Caribbean and African women as well. But what I want to do is just read very briefly the conclusion to this and then open up for questions. And I should also add before I read this conclusion that in one of the chapters I talk about those leftists. We recognize them all, you know, whether it's Spartacus. I hope there's some Spartacus in the house, you know. Spartacus and certain kind of internationalist organizations that always go to like events, particularly people of color events, and they take the microphone and they start giving speeches and speeches and speeches, and then it's like, sit your ass down, you know, and they're telling you stuff that you already know, like you're oppressed, you need to, but you know, that kind of stuff. So you got to understand that I opened up the chapter on socialism with that story. So that's why the way I opened up this conclusion would make a lot of sense, but it goes like this, just one page. Today's mic-hogging, fast-talking, contentious, young and old lefties continue to hawk little books and pamphlets on revolution, always with choice words or documents from Marx, Mao, even Malcolm. But I've never seen a broadside with a black feminist statement, or even the writings of Angela Davis or June Jordan or Barbara Omalade or Flo Kennedy or Audre Lorde, at least not from the groups who call themselves leftists. These women's collective wisdom has provided the richest insights into American radicalism's most fundamental questions. How can we build a multiracial movement? Who are the working class and what do they desire? How do we resolve the Negro question and the woman question? What is freedom? Barbara Smith, one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective, is among the radical voices that have addressed these questions. Since the heyday of the civil rights movement, she has been telling white people that fighting racism is necessary for their own survival and liberation, not some active philanthropy to help the downtrodden Negroes of the ghetto. She has been telling black activists that fighting homophobia is their issue because the policing of sexuality, no matter to whom it is directed, affects everyone. And she has been sharply critical of lesbian and gay movements for the narrowness of their political agendas. She knows what it will take to win freedom. Quote, as a socialist and an alert black woman, it is clear to me that it is not possible to achieve justice, especially economic justice and equality under capitalism, because capitalism was never designed for that to be the case. The assaults from the present system necessitate that most activists work for reforms. But those of us who are radicals understand that it is possible to do so at the very same time that we work for fundamental change, a revolution, end quote. Now there's the real question. Can we all get along long enough to make a revolution? Perhaps, but history tells us that it will mean taking leadership from some very radical women of color, and if that's the case, I'm not holding my breath. What the old guard male militants really need to do is give up the mic for a moment, listen to the victims of democracy sing their dreams of a new world, and take notes on how to fight for the freedom of all. Thank you. Okay, that's it. So we have about, 20 minutes, right? Yeah. Yes. Oh, this is like, this is Oprah style.
Thank you. I've owned and read your book, and I appreciated the credit that you gave to Radical Black Feminists in the chapter on it. I'd like to give you a personal with political type question.
Oh, sure.
I really want to personalize this to make it concrete. Most men see feminism as something that will take something away from them, their power, their manhood, etc. You've been described as a male feminist. I'd like to know, what has feminism given you? Could you please share with us that, and perhaps other men can see that it can benefit them?
Sure. Well, you know, this is a good question, because actually I think it covers everything. You know, I mean, this is the fundamental question, and to me, being a feminist is not a body politic. It's a stance. It's a position you take, and to me it's liberating, because the kind of arguments that feminists across the board have been arguing for, kind of arguments they've been making, have been based on analysis of all forms of oppression: gender oppression, racial oppression, and class oppression. You know, and other kinds of cultural oppressions. Now let's just take gender and sexuality. I mean, because the thing is, almost all the women I talk about in this book, you know, raise issues of class and race. That's clear. But they also raise issues of gender and sexuality. And just to take that, unfortunately, a lot of men are compelled to, they're raised in a society in which masculinity is defined by possessing power, by using violence to solve conflict, by having a front of excess, if you will, you know. And it's a very hard position to take as a man. In other words, men have to be hard all the time, according to the culture. And if you're not, somehow you're being challenged. And to me, it's like, that's not liberation at all, you know. And that's only one example. I mean, if you think about the way that sexuality is policed, you know, where men are expected to be aggressive and women are expected to be passive, imagine what you lose out in terms of actual engagement and exchange, you know. And that's just personal. If you think about political, you know, the fact of the matter, and this is another small thing, the fact of the matter is that we live in societies that are mixed gender, you know. And in these societies, we love and care about the people around us. Men don't just care about men. They care about the women in their lives. So imagine, what's one of the critical arguments made by black radical feminism, black feminism as a whole, that is Black Women's Healthcare Project, you know, that if you figure out how women's bodies are not even considered important by the medical industry, or how they're framed by the medical industry. You think about women's knowledge, whether it's of knowledge of birthing, knowledge of the actual, you know, how bodies operate. I mean, all this knowledge is kind of marginalized for the sake of science, and a science that's built around capitalism. A capitalism that's built around trying to make sure people keep coming back to hospitals, keep coming back to get, like, bandages put on them rather than solve the problem so they could heal themselves. Now, there weren't a lot of men pushing for you know, solving health issues, because those kinds of health issues were more marginalized for women than for men, you know. And men dominate the medical profession. So in a sense, if you improve the healthcare profession for black women alone, you improve it for everybody, you know. And again, we can come up with all kinds of examples. Ultimately, any struggle that's about the emancipation of the people who are, like, in the lowest order, you know, ultimately lead to forms of emancipation for everybody. And this is not a new argument. You know, it's an argument that's been made for a century or more. You know, I mean, Anna Julia Cooper made that argument as well as others. So I think that politically, if anyone calls themselves revolutionary or calls themselves a socialist, you have to be a feminist. If not, then it's not really complete. I don't know a lot of men who have said to me, at least, that they feel like they'll lose something, but they are threatened, and they're threatened by women's power. Why is that? Part of it's because if you grow up in a culture where all power is possessed by a handful of people, you know, or all power is possessed by men, but especially a handful of people, then the idea of sharing power, you know, is a threat. See, and that's, to me, it's very unfortunate that people believe that. I mean, we could talk more about that, but, you know, I don't know if that begins to answer the question. Yes? Okay, I got to make sure and I'll get you.
Hello, I'm a master's student here in the Graduate School of Education, and I'm very adamant about education and education for those who are mostly represented in this room, that is people of color. What do you say to those who are enmeshed in Eurocentric thought that say that Afrocentric thought is not valid?
Well, it's a tricky question because there's so many different kinds of Afrocentric thoughts. And some of those thoughts, some of those ideas, I think, are really problematic and need to be critiqued. There's a lot of things that fall in the rubric of Eurocentric thought. So the first thing is, how do you break out of this binary? You know, that's the first thing. Because the binary between Eurocentric and Afrocentric is a very problematic thing, because much of what we think of, much of what gets passed off as Afrocentric is actually much more Eurocentric. And the reason I say that is because a lot of it's based on using measurements of success that are essentially European, you know, and measurements of success, like, for example, you know, urbanization. And again, I want to be careful because it's wrong to say that urbanization is European, because W.B. Du Bois in his great book, The World in Africa, makes the argument that much of what gets identified as Western civilization had its roots in Northeast and Central Africa and West Africa as well. So again, all these things are not so much Western. It's the fact that part of the development of Western civilization is its naming. You know, once we have the Enlightenment and once we have the sort of boundary creations around this thing called Europe, and the fact that they still call Europe a continent drives me mad. It's not a continent. It's part of Asia. But still, the actual process of the invention of Europe itself was a way to hermetically seal all the kind of exchanges that take place across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, across all these different oceans. Exchanges that actually created what becomes Western civilization. So what we think of as Western civilization is actually a product of a lot of different peoples whose identities are not the same as modern 20th century identities. And so Africa, you know, North and Central and West Africa played a key role in the development of what's called Western civilization. So we have as much claim to that as anyone else, you see? Same thing with Asians. You know, whatever gets defined as Asians, of course, Asians is one of the strange things where you name all kinds of people, from Arabs to South Asians to, you know, East Asians, as all Asians, and they also played a key role in the development of this thing called Western civilization. It's the naming and defining and policing of those boundaries that's the problem. So to me, again, to kind of jump ahead of the question, if this, we as educators, we as scholars, we as thinkers, have to read everything, embrace, imbibe everything, critique everything, and come up with the solutions that are most appropriate for a time and place. And sometimes those solutions may come from the most unusual places. Sometimes we have to come up with solutions that are neither Afrocentric nor Eurocentric according to those definers, but things that we just invent ourselves. And one of the main points of this book is to make the argument that it's in the imagination that we produce our best ideas sometimes. We don't even have to go back for models. I mean, of course, we have to read every model and study every model possible, but sometimes we're so focused on models that we forget to put forward ideas that may come out of the very people we're working with. In other words, the best ideas may not be Eurocentric or Afrocentric, but it may be East Palo Alto-centric. You know what I'm saying? It may be Roxbury-centric. You know, it may be Harlem-centric. It may emerge out of the very youth who you're trying to reach. They may come up with some ideas that are just like out the box, and it may actually provide the answers to where we're going. And unfortunately, we as scholars sometimes listen to that stuff, then we try to put it in a box and frame it and say, well, actually, this is an ancient African thinking from Tanzania, you know, or we say, this is so European thinking. It's, you know, we could trace it back to the Athenian democracy and all this stuff. You know, we're making stuff as we go along. And that's why I love jazz. Because in turn, that's music that never goes backwards and always goes backwards. You know what I mean? It's like, it's music that always is recovering tradition, but always trying to reinvent it and make it new. And if it sounds like something you did before, then you got to sit down. You know? It's okay. This gentleman there.
Just real quickly, my name's Toussaint Lucier. I'm an undergraduate at the college. First, thank you very much for coming here. And I wanted to ask you real quickly, and you spoke on this a little bit, just answering that last question, but you talk in your book about the importance of poetic knowledge. and the importance of creativity in struggle. And I just wanted to know if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, sort of the significance that you found poetry, poetic knowledge playing in the history of struggle, and how that ties into creativity. If you could.
Right. That's a good question. The concept of poetic knowledge I take from Aimé Césaire, who gave a speech in Haiti in 1945, which is called Poetry and Knowledge, and he made the argument, which I agree with, is that there's certain kinds of knowledge that's not scientific knowledge. It's not knowledge that's based on an analysis, but based on a kind of exuberance. It's based on, I don't want to say feeling, but it's not just simply feeling, but it's based on a kind of explosion of thought and feeling together. It's not knowledge that is necessarily manifested in poetry as we know it, formal poetry, but poetic knowledge could be moments of revelation, and sometimes we don't trust those moments of revelation because, again, we're trying to find the source for that revelation. We sense something, we have an argument with someone, and something comes up. It's a great idea, but then we say, okay, no, who said that? Foucault said that. And we're searching for the root. And so, in a sense, I'm not so much making a case that the formal poem as we know it is the source of everything, but rather poetry is something that's lived. It's spoken, it's lived, it's written, it's experienced. And one of the beautiful things about poetry is that it tries to capture the essence of things, if that makes any sense. And again, I can't say words like essence anymore because I get blamed for being essentialist. But it tries to distill things that are intangible, the way we feel about stuff. So much of black people's lives is a day-to-day poem. And again, I'm not limiting to black people. I'm not saying black people are uniquely poetic. That's not what I'm saying. Everyone's lives are poetic. But what I'm thinking of is, I wrote this book called Race Rebels, and there's these moments where these black men and women are getting on the bus, and, sometimes they're told to go back to the back of the bus. Sometimes they pay their money at the front, and they go to the back door, and the bus leaves them. All these moments are poetic moments, because part of what makes them so angry is not the simple act of Jim Crow, but the day-to-day indignities of looking at people in the eye who haven't even read as much as you, and they have power over your lives. It's those indignities that lead those black women to pick up their umbrellas and beat white people over the head over seats, which happened all throughout Birmingham in the 40s. These are acts of emotional explosion, which I would argue are poetic acts. They're not based on the kind of not like they came in with an analysis and said, I'm being denied my place in the bus, and I pay my fare, and they have an analysis of it. It's a moment of explosion, and it's precisely those kinds of moments that we don't always pay attention to as poetic moments, because we sometimes treat the subjects of history as completely either homo economicus, whatever that word is. I never learned Latin, so like economic thinking, or rational based on sets of rationalities that you can kind of document on a page. But sometimes it's precisely the feeling of indignity, that one moment too much, that could lead people to revolt. And that's partly what I'm trying to get at. But the question, of course, is, what do you do with that knowledge? How do you capture those poetic moments and turn them into something that might be a more richer analysis, which is what I'm trying to get at in the book. So, let's see.
How you doing?
Yes.
My question kind of deals basically with this issue of like past, present, and future, and kind of dealing with what you were talking about before with like the potential for creativity now, especially with young people. But my question is, what do you foresee? Do you foresee any struggles apart from racism, classism, sexism that will confront blacks and Latinos in the near future?
Besides racism, classism, and sexism. I'm about to say, that sums it up. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. Well, see, the thing, I guess I don't see those three categories as precisely what people are struggling. In other words, those categories are descriptors of the institutional and psychological and social and cultural struggles that people are involved in. So it may not appear to look like classism or racism. I mean, that's part of the magic of those things, is that we don't always know when we experience things what the source of it is. I think that I guess I would think of all the struggles that people have to wage. Some of that struggle has to do with things that are not institutionally bound. And this may be a way to answer your question, that maybe the biggest struggle is trying to change the way we behave towards each other. In other words, change our values. And I'm not just talking about people of color, I'm talking about everybody. That much of changing our culture in the context of racism, sexism, classism, is trying to figure out how to overthrow these things in our own lives. And to me, that may be one of the most significant kinds of struggles that we have to wage. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm really interested in, and I quote all throughout the book, the writings of Grace Lee Boggs, and James Boggs, who passed away years ago. But Grace Lee is still with us and still writing this amazing stuff. They have always made this argument that we need to change the culture that we're in, where we're at. And if we don't do that, we can't always look to, in other words, even if you eliminate the institutions that oppress us, we'll still oppress each other, And I think that's a very, very important lesson. And one of the reasons I kind of got into surrealism was they made the argument for what Andre Breton calls a revolution of the mind. And the revolution of the mind is not just the sort of overthrowing of victim status. It's also trying to change people's sense of what's possible. I think that it's just as much of a mistake to support conservative values, strictly conservative values, as a way to solve the problem of really destructive behavior. Because I think some of those conservative values are equally destructive, especially if you're a woman, especially if you're a youth. But there's got to be a way in which that we can empower ourselves and create a new culture, among ourselves, across lines of color, class, gender, sexual orientation, and generation, where we can actually begin from a mode of love and redefine what love is. Love is not a marketable commodity, Love is something that, as Dr. King talked about, it's a constant struggle for community. And that's where I think we have to begin. That's maybe the most important struggle we have to engage in right now. And this gentleman actually had his hand up for a while. And then...
you want a little poetic? You're going to get a little poetic.
I can't express what I feel. May I stand?
Mm-hmm. By all means.
In all my time in universities, I never saw or heard anyone like you. It's surrealistic. Now, for you to appear like that, and you're very berry, you're past time. You could have come out of the Elizabethan period. The way you look, this is it's the integrity of it. There's something of as laid back as Miles Davis, with your understated, but the mind is working. But you could say it was poetry, or you could say it was like incantation. You could say it was dance, and your everything in sync with a quality, sort of I'll use the word angelic. But you look, now, to do it this way, it's the first time I've seen someone get it all together. Now, the phrase I want to use, just, breaking it down so we can deal with it. But on the highest level, plus down. Now, the phrase from the street I would say, brother, you really got your shit together, because it's all there. Now, what makes it so great? Now, I'll sit down. In this place where it's the life of the mind, all that, you brought you touched the realm of the affect, the feeling, the emotionality. And that great word, veritas, I happen to like the truth. Well, there's a certain beauty in truth, your expression and your bearing. And so I want to say to you that you are an event in my life. and I don't even know what phrase to use. Ruth tells me I shouldn't use the phrase. But the phrase is the enormity of the occasion. Where did you come from? You're out of time and space and your mind. So thank you very much, and I'll say this to you. You're showing us how to do it. This is the cutting edge. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Well, I appreciate that very much. And you, sir, you may not remember, but about 15 years ago, we met before. I had, and we actually had a conversation, and much of what I'm talking about, I learned from you. No, really. Yes. You probably don't remember, but we'll talk. Yeah. Yeah, no, really. And I guess I could take, what, one more hour?
Take one more.
And I got to take,
Somebody over here, yeah.
yeah, or actually, what about her and in the middle? Okay. I'll be brief. I know I've run too long. I apologize.
It's lovely to see you. I've read one of your books. But what I want to ask you is that you've talked about the past of revolutions and socialist tradition and struggle, and how you want to capture them. But what do you think, or what is your thought about the constant turmoil in America, like, for example, September 11 or past Vietnam? How does that disrupt or improve the black struggle against all sorts of things? What is your opinion about the September 11th and the constant change of laws and regulation and rules and constitutional things that were put in place, which in the end protect black people and other minorities? And what do you think about that and that revolutionary change that you're talking about?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because the introduction and the epilogue talk about September 11th and its impact on my writing and also on the situation. As a historian, people will probably be mad about this, but I think of September 11th as really a significant event, no doubt, but a small blip in a long history. The good thing that it did, if there's anything good about this, and of course there's not much good in any kind of death. Even death of the enemy is not good. Death is just a horrible thing, and that's why I'm an anti-war person. But the one thing that it actually interestingly did was it opened up two things. It opened up a discussion of what is terrorism, and it compelled, I think, younger generations to think really hard about the history of terrorism in the United States. It's a long, ignoble tradition, and black people are not the only victims of that terrorism. But it's a long tradition, and the sad thing is that in some respects, just like September 11th was perceived as state-sponsored, in other words, that whether it's Saudi Arabia on the sly or Iraq or whatever, the perception of state-sponsored terrorism, which of course in Afghanistan, of course, allows the military to go and bomb innocent children and families and everything. We don't talk about the reality of state-sponsored terrorism in the United States, that much of terrorism that was meted out on Chinese, on people of African descent, on Latinos in this country was, in fact, indirectly or directly, depending on circumstances, sponsored by the state. Doesn't make it good. It makes it terrible. It gives us a discourse to be able to critique it and talk about it. And I think that if we're going to be completely anti-terrorists, we've got to make sure that we're completely anti-terrorists of all forms of terrorism. The bombing of abortion clinics, that's terrorism. If you're going to punish people for crimes, the people who do that should be punished as well, if you're going to do that. Okay. The second thing, I think, which is a strange sort of indirect, I don't want to say benefit's not the right word, but it's the consequence, which is not so bad, is that it's compelling people now to pay attention to the world. And it's amazing how the last generations across the last sort of 10 years, across generations really, how isolated Americans have been. They wouldn't even know where Afghanistan is. And suddenly now you got to pay attention to what's going on around the world. We've got to pay attention to the view of America from abroad. And I think that I'm very confident that young people, for the most part, are open to trying to get at the truth. And if they get at the truth, then what we may see in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe, is the biggest anti-war movement we've ever seen. Ever. Because we can't afford to continue like this. And better than an anti-war movement, we may actually see a peace movement, which is not the same thing, Anyway.
Yes.
You got the last word.
Okay. I thought Freedom Dreams was very inspirational and courageous in a lot of ways. As you were speaking today, I was very interested to hear you talk about your mother and how she's at Berkeley in ethnic studies. And my question deals with the study of race as a concept in and of itself. And I was wondering what you feel about that, and also about kind of what advice you would give to somebody that was thinking about pursuing a graduate degree or a doctorate degree in ethnic studies with all the shifting and transformations that seem to be going on in a lot of African American studies departments and Africana studies departments, and even the labeling of what it is you're actually studying falls under numerous categories, I feel, because it can be labeled under, Africana studies, American studies, cultural studies, and so I was wondering if you could shed light on that a little bit.
Okay. Well, when this is over, let me give you my card, my email address, because that's a long, that requires a long conversation. But I'll say it real briefly because we have to do this other thing. I guess there are two questions. What I think about the study of race as an entity in itself. We're blessed by some great scholars, who have studied race, but always studied it in a context. In fact, there's one here, Professor Lonnie Guinier, who's like one of the great scholars of all time on several questions, particularly on race, but how it actually operates, not just in public policy and the law, but it actually operates in society we live in. And I think that it's that kind of work is very, very important. And it's also work that people are doing outside of a black-white divide. Anyone who studies race can no longer do the black. Even though we could have a conversation about that for a long time, about why anti-black racism is a peculiar sort of thing, it still operates within this realm in which race is operating on various different levels. So yeah, it's a very important thing to do, and I think there will never be a shortage of studies of race, because the reason people study race is not because of curiosity, because racism still is with us. And the most important studies are those that are trying to dismantle it. That's why whiteness studies started out as a very powerful thing. The idea behind whiteness studies was to study white supremacy, white identity in order to dismantle racism. And all those critical figures came out of social movements that did so, Then it somehow took a little turn to making white identity more relevant. Not everyone, but some people do that. The final thing I'll say about programs, no matter what program you get your degree in, and this is relevant for everyone, just make sure you write a bomb dissertation. It doesn't, in a sense, if your stuff is tight, if you write the book that you want to write, people will love it. They'll learn from it. They'll be challenged by it. And no matter what your pedigree is, or they'll find a place for you, because you make a place for yourself. I talk to too many students who are so busy strategizing about whether or not to be in interdisciplinary programs versus a discipline and that sort of thing. But in the end, it's still all the good work is interdisciplinary. All of it is, because disciplines themselves are magician tricks. Their disciplines themselves they can't police the boundaries that well. You see, and they keep remaking themselves. And so no matter where you do it, as long as you go to a place where you have people who support your work, you have colleagues who are smart like you, other graduate students who are doing some of this kind of stuff, who could support you, get your work done within a reasonable amount of time. You don't want to hang out in graduate school for a long time. Get it done. Get it, publish it, and make sure that you're honest about your work and that it's politically relevant to you, because you got to live with it for the rest of your life. Don't ever pick a topic based on what your advisor says is a hot topic. Don't ever pick a topic based on doing your advisor's research. Don't ever pick a topic based on, what you see as a niche in the field. Pick a topic that speaks to you in revolutionary cadences. And when you embrace it and it's yours, no matter what, it's going to be exciting, and everyone's going to be happy, and your life will be good, and that's it. That's all, folks.